the first 49 days, where the soul, the brain, and the world learn to meet. Ladies and gentlemen, human beings do not simply arrive in the world, we pass through it. Between what we call before birth and after birth, there exists a threshold, a narrow yet profound passage where something deeply mysterious takes place. Medicine refers to this passage as development. Philosophy calls it becoming. Ancient spiritual traditions describe it as a journey of the soul. But at the intersection of Tibetan Buddhist teachings, Eastern mind-body philosophy, and modern neuroscience, we encounter a question so fundamental that it resists any simple answer. When does a human being truly become human? And what, if anything, do we carry with us when we cross into this world? This lecture begins precisely at that question. Today, we will explore the first 49 days after birth, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a critical developmental threshold. We will examine memory reorganization, parental caregiving, early emotional circuitry, explosive synaptic growth, and the profound ways early environments sculpt temperament. This is a journey across disciplines, between science and mystery, neurology and spirituality, philosophy and developmental psychology. And if this exploration resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe and share so that others may join us on this intellectual journey. Why 49 days? A number that refuses to be coincidence. Across civilizations, the number 49 appears with striking persistence. In Buddhist tradition, it is said that after death, consciousness remains in an intermediate state, the bardo, for 49 days before transitioning to a new existence. Tibetan funeral rites are structured entirely around this period, viewing it as the time during which the soul searches for orientation and form. Ancient traditions described this interval as a transitional adaptation period for the soul. What is remarkable and deeply unsettling for modern thinkers is that contemporary neuroscience highlights the same postnatal window as one of extraordinary sensitivity. This convergence is not merely symbolic. It suggests a structural truth about human development. The newborn brain is not an incomplete adult brain. At birth, the infant brain is not a smaller, unfinished version of an adult brain. It is something far more radical. It is a brain in a state of extreme plasticity, undergoing simultaneous growth and structural organization at a speed never again matched in the human lifespan. Neuroscientists refer to this as a critical period, a window in which experience does not merely influence development, but actively builds neural architecture. During approximately the first 7 weeks, roughly 49 days, the newborn brain exhibits explosive growth in synaptic density, initial formation of emotional response circuits, high-frequency learning based on external stimulus patterns, early stabilization of sleep-wake rhythms, rapid acquisition of sensitivity to facial expressions and vocal tones. In other words, the brain is not passively receiving information, it is actively configuring itself in response to the world. First, the explosion of sensory synapses. The most dramatic change during this period occurs in the sensory cortex. Synapses, the communication points between neurons, are produced in massive excess. This overproduction is intentional. The infant brain generates far more connections than it will eventually keep, anticipating. That experience will determine which pathways survive. During this phase, the sensory system collects visual, auditory, and tactile input with extreme sensitivity, undergoes structural changes in response to even minimal repetition, records caregiving patterns before abstract cognition is possible. The infant is not learning concepts. It is learning the rhythm and texture of reality itself. This sensory foundation becomes the scaffolding upon which emotion, cognition, and identity will later be built. Second, the formation of emotional response circuits. The second major transformation involves emotional architecture. Key structures, the amygdala, insula, hypothalamus, and prefrontal cortex begin forming the circuitry responsible for evaluating safety and threat. Here, caregiving behavior plays a decisive role. Consistent, regulated care dampens amygdala hyperreactivity and establishes emotional stability. Chaotic or harsh stimulation increases threat sensitivity and hypervigilance. This is not a matter of comfort versus discomfort. It is the construction of a lifelong emotional response algorithm. The caregiving environment during the first 49 days determines whether the world is encoded as fundamentally safe or inherently dangerous. Third, high-frequency pattern-based learning. Contrary to popular belief, newborns are not cognitively empty. They are extraordinary pattern learners. During this period, infants respond more to repetition than consequence. They are highly sensitive to temporal regularity, rhythm, pacing, predictability. They respond instantly to emotional tone in voices and facial expressions. Their rate of stimulus storage far exceeds that of adults. The infant is not learning from experience in the adult sense. It is absorbing the structure of the world and encoding it into neural form. Fourth, the alignment of sleep-wake rhythms. Another essential process unfolding during this window is the gradual alignment of circadian rhythms. Newborns are born without a fully established biological clock. Their rhythms are shaped externally by light exposure, caregiving schedules, and environmental consistency. Stable routines promote regulated arousal cycles. Irregular care increases sleep fragmentation and emotional sensitivity. These rhythms influence not only sleep, but attention, emotional regulation, and physical growth. Fifth, the birth of social perception. Finally, around the end of this 49-day period, a remarkable shift occurs. Infants begin to differentiate emotional expressions, interpret vocal tone as safety or threat, distinguish caregivers from strangers, exhibit early emotional mimicry. This marks the emergence of the brain's social signal processing system, the foundation for attachment, language acquisition, and social cognition. 49 days as synchronization, not adaptation. The first 49 days are not simply about survival. They represent the first synchronization between the human organism and the external world. During this time, sensory circuits, emotional architecture, social perception, biological rhythms, and learning mechanisms are configured simultaneously. This configuration will shape emotional and cognitive functioning for decades. Thus, the phrase, "the mystery of 49 days," is not mystical exaggeration. It is an accurate description of a developmental truth. Memory not erased, but reordered. A question inevitably arises. Why do we not remember this time? Neuroscience offers a partial answer. The hippocampus is immature. But this explanation addresses only half the truth. What truly occurs during this period is memory reordering. Prenatal experiences are stored as implicit memory, sensory, and emotional patterns rather than narrative recollections. During the first 49 days, these patterns are reorganized to fit a new neural and environmental framework. What disappears is not memory itself, but its narrative accessibility. What remains is temperament. This is why we observe unexplained anxiety, immediate calming responses to certain vocal tones, sensory hypersensitivity, patterns of social openness or withdrawal. Ancient Buddhist teachings state, memory fades, but disposition remains. Neuroscience states, explicit memory disappears, but emotional and sensory patterns persist as temperament. Different languages, same reality. Conclusion. The threshold of becoming. The first 49 days after birth represent the soul's adaptation to the world in spiritual language, the brain's rapid synchronization with environmental patterns in scientific terms. Ancient traditions called this the settling of the soul. Modern science calls it a synaptic critical period. Both are describing the same phenomenon. Human beings do not begin as blank slates. They begin as beings already patterned by experience, learning, adapting, and becoming, before words, before memory, before conscious thought. And this is why the earliest signals, gentle touch, stable voices, predictable warmth, carry such immense weight. No therapy, no education can fully replace what is encoded during these first 49 days. That is why this threshold matters, not just biologically, but existentially. From synchronization to direction, how early care shapes the architecture of the soul and the brain. In the previous part of this lecture, we examined the first 49 days of life as a period of synchronization, a critical window during which the human brain rapidly aligns itself with the rhythms, signals, and emotional textures of the external world. We saw that memory is not erased, but reordered, that the newborn is not a blank slate, but a being already patterned by implicit experience, and that ancient spiritual traditions and modern neuroscience, despite their different vocabularies, converge on the same truth. The earliest period of life is not passive adaptation, but active configuration. Now we must take the next step. If the brain is synchronizing, if emotional and sensory circuits are being wired at extraordinary speed, then a deeper question inevitably follows. Who or what is providing the pattern to which this human life is synchronizing? This brings us to the subject of early caregiving. Early care is not protection. It is construction. Most people understand caregiving as a form of protection, feeding the infant, keeping the child safe, ensuring survival. But when we examine early care through the combined lens of neuroscience and contemplative philosophy, a radically different picture emerges. Early care is not merely about keeping a child alive. It is a sculptural process. It is the moment-by-moment shaping of neural architecture, emotional algorithms, and if we adopt the language of spiritual traditions, the directional orientation of the soul itself. In other words, caregiving is not maintenance. It is design. The invisible inputs that shape a human being during the early postnatal period, especially within the first 49 days, the infant nervous system is maximally open to imprinting. Several caregiving variables prove decisive. The emotional stability of the caregiver, frequency and quality of physical touch, consistency of response, tone, rhythm, and prosody of voice, speed and reliability of response to distress, the caregiver's own stress patterns. These inputs are not interpreted cognitively. They are processed directly by the infant's autonomic nervous system and encoded into core neural circuits involving the amygdala, threat detection, the prefrontal cortex, self-regulation, the hippocampus, contextual memory integration. What emerges from this process is not a learned behavior, but a core personality structure. Core personality, the emotional architecture beneath identity. Neuroscience refers to this outcome as core personality, a set of deeply ingrained emotional response patterns that persist across the lifespan. Attachment research identifies several dominant configurations. Secure attachment. Internal model. The world is safe. Characteristics. Emotional regulation. Self-trust. Relational stability. Resilience under stress. Foundation, consistent, emotionally regulated caregiving. Anxious attachment. Internal model. The world is unpredictable. Characteristics: hypervigilance, dependence, reassurance seeking, rejection sensitivity. Foundation: inconsistent responses. Caregivers under chronic stress. Avoidant attachment. Internal model. Depending on others is dangerous. Characteristics: emotional suppression, excessive, self-reliance, relational withdrawal. Foundation: emotionally unavailable caregiving, minimal physical or emotional contact. Disorganized attachment. Internal model. The world is chaotic and threatening. Characteristics: emotional volatility, impulsivity, relational confusion, exaggerated threat responses. Foundation caregivers who are themselves traumatized, unpredictable, or emotionally unstable. These are not choices the child makes. They are patterns the nervous system adopts in order to survive. The spiritual language of direction. Bardo consciousness. Ancient Tibetan texts, particularly those associated with the Bardo Thodol, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describe this process in symbolic terms. They speak of consciousness entering life with a predisposition, a directional current, often described as two fundamental modes. Bright Bardo consciousness, associated with trust, openness, receptivity, and growth. Dark Bardo consciousness, associated with mistrust, withdrawal, aggression, and control. To modern ears, this may sound mystical, but when translated into psychological language, the correspondence is striking. Bright consciousness aligns with secure attachment and regulated emotional systems. Dark consciousness aligns with chronic hyperarousal, defensive orientation, and threat-based cognition. Different metaphors, same phenomena. Stress as a signal about reality. From both perspectives, spiritual and neuroscientific, the decisive factor is not ideology, belief, or intention. It is felt reality. When caregivers exist in a state of chronic stress, their nervous systems broadcast danger signals continuously. The infant does not interpret these signals consciously. Instead, the infant's nervous system draws a conclusion. This world is hostile. That conclusion becomes embedded as a baseline assumption. Conversely, when caregivers are emotionally regulated, responsive, and present, the infant's nervous system internalizes a different premise. This world responds. This world is safe enough to explore. This premise becomes the foundation upon which personality, relationships, and life choices are built. Caregiving as neural architecture design. The first months of life, especially the first 49 days, represent a period of extreme neural plasticity. During this time, neurons proliferate, synapses form in massive excess, autonomic regulation patterns stabilize. Common caregiving behaviors: holding, vocalizing, responding to. Cries are not emotional gestures. They are structural inputs. They function as design specifications for the developing nervous system. Caregiving is not an environmental event. It is neural blueprinting. 6 determinants of emotional architecture. Let us examine these inputs more precisely. 1. Emotional regulation of the caregiver. The infant nervous system synchronizes with the caregiver's autonomic state. Calm caregivers transmit stable physiological rhythms. Dysregulated caregivers transmit stress signatures. 2. Physical touch. Repeated touch regulates body temperature, hormone balance, and oxytocin release, forming the foundation of emotional self-regulation. 3. Consistency. Predictable responses suppress amygdala overactivation. Unpredictability conditions the brain into permanent threat monitoring. 4. Vocal tone and rhythm. High, sharp tones are processed as danger signals. Slow, rhythmic speech is encoded as safety. These signals imprint directly onto the brainstem and limbic system. 5. Response to distress. Immediate response encodes the belief the world responds. Chronic non-response encodes the world is indifferent. 6. Stress model. Infants learn through observation at the physiological level. The caregiver's stress rhythms become the child's default emotional tempo. Together, these factors shape the autonomic nervous system, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus, creating a stable emotional architecture that will guide behavior long after childhood. Core personality is not learned. It is installed. The brain assigns synaptic weight based on repetition. What repeats most during early life becomes most real. Thus, core personality is not the result of later experiences. It is the neural summary of early caregiving patterns. Later life can modify behavior, but it rarely rewrites this foundation entirely. The point of convergence. Spiritual traditions describe this as the soul's directional settling. Neuroscience describes it as the stabilization of emotional circuitry. Both are correct. Early care does not merely shape behavior. It defines how reality itself is perceived, and that perception becomes destiny. From early architecture to lifelong destiny. Emotional regulation, reactivity, and the final convergence of soul and brain. In the previous section, we arrived at a critical conclusion. Early caregiving does not merely shape behavior. It defines how reality itself is perceived. Once that perceptual framework is installed, once the nervous system settles into its default assumptions about safety, threat, trust, and response, a far more consequential process begins. That process is regulation versus reactivity. And here, modern psychology and ancient spiritual traditions meet once again with almost unsettling precision. Two languages, one phenomenon. When we translate the language of the Bardo tradition into the vocabulary of contemporary psychology, the correspondence is nearly exact. Bright Bardo consciousness aligns with secure attachment and stable emotional regulation. Dark Bardo consciousness aligns with chronic hyperarousal, threat-based perception, avoidance, and reactive aggression. The difference lies not in substance, but in method. Spiritual language uses symbols. Psychological science uses data. Both are describing the same internal architecture. The core principle is simple. The emotional environment of the prenatal period and early postnatal life concretizes temperament, what Tibetan tradition symbolically names Bardo consciousness. The fork in the road. How environment divides light and shadow. Let us examine how environment pushes temperament toward one direction or the other. 1. Extreme stress environments. When caregivers exist in sustained states of anxiety, anger, helplessness, or emotional collapse, the infant nervous system interprets this not as context, but as reality itself. The result is a cascade of consequences. A distrust-based worldview is installed. Threat detection circuits corresponding to dark Bardo consciousness are reinforced. Amygdala hyperactivation becomes chronic. From a spiritual lens, this is described as an environment that expands dark consciousness. From a neurobiological lens, it is the chronic upregulation of threat monitoring circuits. The outcome is the same. Heightened vigilance, reactive aggression. Avoidance as a survival strategy. 2. Stable and attuned environments. By contrast, environments that are predictable, emotionally warm, and responsive activate an entirely different architecture, a trust-based worldview, accurate interpretation of social signals, stable activation of the prefrontal cortex, strong emotional recovery circuits. Spiritually, this is described as the expansion of bright consciousness. Psychologically, it is described as secure attachment and mature emotional regulation. Different words, same internal structure. Bardo as algorithm, not metaphor. At this point, something crucial becomes clear. What appears to be a mystical doctrine is, in fact, a developmental algorithm. The light and darkness of Bardo consciousness are not moral categories. They are outcomes of emotional data processing. Once we understand the neuromechanics of early caregiving, the symbolic language reveals itself to be surprisingly literal. Synaptic overproduction, the scientific parallel. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of the soul passing through confusion, choice, alignment, and fixation. Developmental neuroscience describes the early brain using strikingly similar stages. Synaptic overproduction, experience-dependent selection, synaptic strengthening and pruning, circuit stabilization. Between birth and approximately 3 years of age, the human brain produces 2 to 3 times more synapses than it will ever need. From a purely biological standpoint, this appears inefficient. Why create such excess? Because excess allows choice. Confusion as potential. Synaptic overproduction is a state of structured chaos. Every possible connection is tentatively open. Every future remains plausible. The brain waits. It waits for environmental signals to tell it which patterns matter. In Tibetan language, this stage is described as the soul, expanding into multiple possibilities while seeking resonance with the world. Different phrasing. Identical structure. Experience chooses the circuit. After overproduction comes selection. Neuroscience calls this experience-dependent selection. Connections that are repeatedly activated are strengthened. Connections that are unused are eliminated. The criteria are clear. Repetition over novelty. Survival relevance over abstraction. Emotional salience over logic. This is not learning in the academic sense. It is existential encoding. The infant brain absorbs parental tone, facial expression, rhythm, stress level, and emotional presence at a speed that borders on the inhuman. The child learns not intellectually, but neurologically what kind of world this is. Alignment, when chaos finds order. In spiritual texts, this stage is called alignment. In neuroscience, it is known as synaptic strengthening and pruning. Billions of connections are sorted. Frequently used pathways are reinforced. Rarely used pathways are removed. Emotional response circuits stabilize. Autonomic patterns settle into default modes. This is where temperament emerges. A gentle environment produces gentle circuitry. A hostile environment produces defensive circuitry. At this precise point, the symbolic distinction between bright and dark consciousness aligns perfectly with psychological attachment styles. Fixation, why temperament persists. Why does temperament remain so resistant to change? There are three structural reasons. 1. The closure of the plasticity window. Early childhood represents a peak in neuroplasticity. Once this window closes, foundational architecture becomes increasingly fixed. 2. Emotional circuits are prioritized. The brain encodes emotional meaning before language, logic, or narrative identity. Safety and threat judgments are finalized first and govern all later cognition. 3. Repetition solidifies structure. The same caregiver, the same voice, the same rhythm, the same emotional pattern every single day. Repetition hardens circuitry. By the time conscious memory develops, the architecture is already in place. Temperament is the soil of personality. Temperament does not determine every action, but it determines the range within which actions occur. Adult personality operates on top of a structure that was largely completed before language. This is why people repeat relationship patterns they consciously reject. Why insight alone rarely produces transformation. Why emotional reactions often feel automatic and inevitable. The final convergence. 2 journeys, 1 process. Spiritual tradition says, the soul restructures itself to enter a new world, selects its orientation, and that orientation becomes its earthly temperament. Neuroscience says, the brain produces excess synapses, selects circuits based on experience, stabilizes. Emotional architecture and temperament emerges. The journeys are parallel. The language is different. The phenomenon is the same, a unified view of human becoming. What this convergence reveals is profound. Human development is not merely biological, nor is it purely spiritual. It is a mutual shaping between organism and environment, between consciousness and circuitry, between the world as it is and the world as it is felt. Across these 3 lectures, we have explored the mystery of the first 49 days, the reordering of memory before conscious recall, the formation of core personality through caregiving, the branching of bright and dark consciousness, the striking convergence between Bardo doctrine and synaptic development. All of it leads to a single message. We are not accidents. We are patterned beings, and within those patterns, there is meaning. If today's lecture has expanded your perspective even slightly, I invite you to subscribe and share so that others may join this philosophical journey into what it truly means to become human. For deeper explorations and extended lectures, feel free to reach out at any time.